Now, it's interesting talking about emerging Europe, the Middle East and Africa, which apparently many of you thought will perform relatively well this year. For most people, definitely meeting a lot of clients, emerging Europe, Middle East, Africa equals corruption, conflict and chaos. And that is a perception out there. And I've asked many people, does anyone have any positive adjective in mind when I say the word Russia? So people say there's skepticism about China, and people don't believe the Brazilian story, and I guess there are people that don't. But I think there's no country in the world which engenders as much hatred, wrongly, as Russia. And it's obviously done a lot to try and create that. But I think what Russia needs more than anything is a decent PR agency. And we are very positive on Russia and indeed the rest of emerging Europe. And I think this is for several reasons. One, contrary to popular belief, the markets in emerging Europe, Middle East, etc., have grown fast. They've grown fast, and it's not just the markets that have grown fast. A very important point made by Nick earlier, it's not just GDP which is important, it's also profitable growth, which is, at the end of the day, we invest in companies, not countries. So I think the first point I'd like to make is over the last 10 years, despite the problems in over the last year or so, emerging Europe, Middle East and Africa, they've got some absolutely fabulous growing countries, growing economies, and that perception of corruption, conflict and chaos is wrong. I think we've got to get around in our own minds the stereotype portrayed in the media about the region and appreciate actually what we've got is fast-changing economies that are growing fast, middle class is emerging, and the opportunity for ongoing fast growth, whether it's the demographic argument in Africa, whether it's real structural and political change in the Middle East, or whether it is a growing consumer story in emerging Europe, there's a lot to be said about this region. If we go forward a slide, and this is the point we try to put over, people sort of see Russia as purely an oil play. This is very untrue. Russia is a global commodity play. Whether it's gold or platinum or palladium or a whole series of commodities, even water, Russia is your global commodity powerhouse. If one is positive on the world and one's positive about growth, then Russia is the place to be. As pointed out earlier, it's also unbelievably cheap. I wish Russia traded at 12 times earnings. Russia trades at roughly half the price to book value of other emerging markets. Now, there are good reasons why Russia should trade at a discount to other emerging markets. I don't dispute that. But if you trade at half the multiple, it means you can go up 50% and still be 25% cheaper. And I think that it's simple mathematics, but I think it's worth bearing that in mind. I don't dispute there are challenges. I don't dispute the fact that we don't all necessarily like the Russian political system. We don't have to live there. We have to invest there, and that's a big, that's a very, very important. That's a very, very important distinction. Putin, which again, for many people say is a very bad leader, I think it's much more important to be valued in your country than outside your country. Tony Blair was always more popular outside the UK than he was in the UK. Mr. Putin is much more popular inside Russia than he is outside Russia. He's got 80% approval ratings, which tells you one thing. People domestically are impressed with what he's done. And it doesn't really make a difference if I, sitting in London, doesn't like the gentleman at a personal level. He's done a great job in transforming Russia, and I think that's important to realise. If we go forward a slide, fixed income markets, which generally, professionals in the fixed income markets are probably better than us equity guys. And what's really interesting, I think that's been shown time and time again. What's really interesting is that Russia's fixed income market has rebounded all the way back to the peaks of late 2007, 2008, whereas the equity market is still 40% lower, which tells you one very clear thing. Us equity guys are behind. Generally, fixed income leads equity markets. Markets have recovered, obviously, in the last year, but Russia is a structural growth story. As I said, GDP 7% a year for the last 10 years, ROEs that are high and rising, a really impressive EPS growth over the next few years, probably amongst the best in the world, 55–60% over the next 2 years, according to Goldman Sachs numbers, not mine. So what's really impressive for us is the combination of fast growth that's profitable and is not priced by the market. And finally, just a word on Hungary. I think it's just interesting because when people say Central Europe, the first reaction I get is, oh, those are heavily indebted countries, they're really big problems, and sort of people point to Latvia. Now, Latvia is a very fine country, but it has about as much relevance for the rest of Eastern Europe as, dare I say it, I don't know, Vietnam has for China or Venezuela has for Brazil. It's tangential. The GDP of Latvia is roughly the same as the London borough of Hounslow. And I think that's worth bearing in mind when people are saying that Latvia is a problem for Russia just because it borders it. For us, the really big changes, and I think it's interesting, just this week I had the privilege of meeting the Hungarian Prime Minister just 3 days ago, and what's really interesting is how one country has totally transformed its economy and the structure of its economy in just a few years. When people say Hungary, they think of twin deficits. What's actually happened is the currency's fallen significantly. It's actually got a small current account surplus, and unlike places like the UK, into the middle of the recession, they were cutting government spending. They increased the retirement age. So actually, across the OECD, Hungary is now the best positioned in terms of a structural fiscal surplus which they have. That's totally in contrast to what people think out there. So emerging Europe, Middle East and Africa, a place that people love to hate, a place with great opportunities, a place with pretty cheap valuations and fast growth. And with that, I hand it back to Quintin.
Great.